like to say welcome to everybody. Welcome to the March first full week of spring 2025 edition of the Labor Market Insight Series from the Idaho Department of Labor. My name is Craig Shaul, and I'm a Research Analyst Supervisor here at the department and your host, as well as one of the presenters. To give a quick employment situation update as people are logging in, January's unemployment rate held steady from December's rate at 3.8%. Our non-farm payroll employment led the nation with 2.8% over-the-year growth in January from the previous January. And just as a reminder, in case you don't know, January and February releases for our employment situations have kind of non-standard release dates due to the Bureau of Labor Statistics benchmarking process. In fact, we'll have our February rates here at the end of this week on Friday. And then for March's data, we'll return back to our normal kind of third Friday of each month, or 2 weeks after the national release. Sometimes not exactly the third Friday, but March's data will be released on April 16th. For those that are interested in county data, the benchmark, that county data won't be available until that March release. So even though February and January's data will be released here fully in the end of this week, the county data won't be available until we have that March. And that's, again, due to the benchmarking process. With that, we got a few screens open, so making sure I'm hitting the right thing. Let's see. So today's topic is we're going to be looking at rural Idaho, basically. And why we're doing that is this year we're conducting a 2025 rural profile. We're actually going to take kind of a comprehensive look at rural over the coming year. The topic of the first part we're dealing with today and part of this webinar is the demographics. Today we'll go over kind of what that rural definition is, the population change and how that has affected Idaho's counties and the rural aspect of Idaho, as well as the age and a little bit of education. But we know that's just kind of a finite little, again, we're taking a comprehensive look at rural this year. So we'll be doing kind of different parts and volumes through the year. We'll do a second part on economics and workforce, and when we release that, have a webinar in June of this year. Then we'll be looking at some critical trends and have another webinar in September. And then we'll compile all this into a final report in December. But I should also say we will be releasing these parts as their own independent report along with the webinars. In fact, one for this will be available in a week or two after this webinar. So you'll be able to see that report as part of, and we'll publish that along with basically what we're basing this off of a rural profile from 2005, and we'll get to that here in a second. But before I do, I just want to introduce the panelists I have with me that are much more knowledgeable about this topic than me. First, we have Jan Roeser. She's our labor economist in Southwest Idaho. She's here in the Boise office with me. Hello, Jan.
Hi.
And then we also have Seth Harrington. He's our labor economist covering the south central part of Idaho in our Twin Falls office. Thank you for joining me, Seth. Before we kind of get into the meat here, just want to kind of bounce off you guys. What is rural? And I think one of the reasons I have to say this webinar has a lot of attention. It's probably one of the most attended we've had, at least in a while. And I think rural captures people's imagination. They have a connection with it for the state, which is not surprising. But I would like to ask Jan and Seth. I mean, as we started this project, I want to know is there anything that draws you to the topic of rural in Idaho? Anything that makes this kind of study special for you? We'll start with Jan.
Yeah, absolutely. I grew up, and some of you would know this, I grew up in Mountain Home, and it was just such a perfect mix of the agriculture that was so strong in Idaho, particularly back then, but it also had the mix of the Mountain Home Air Force Base. And I lived there as growing up in my childhood, but I also lived there as an adult with my young children and found it to be fabulous then because you had really inexpensive Montessori. You had housing that was nice and affordable. And I think that's some of the things that draw people to rural Idaho is maybe some of the affordability. But you also have such a presence in the community. People know each other and you're accountable and you can make a difference. And so I think rural Idaho is great. I do not live there now. I have lived in Gooding County as well, but I'm not sure where I'll end up in retirement. So yeah, maybe.
Sounds good. All right. Thank you, Jan. How about you, Seth?
I don't have the connection Jan does to rural Idaho. I grew up in the Portland, Oregon metro area, but I did go to college out in Eastern Idaho, and I've been in Twin
Wow.
Falls for a couple of years. So I really have I quieter life, a little calmer. Definitely appreciate that, and also the natural amenities out in Idaho have been very impressive. So that's something I've really come to cherish.
That's good. Well, great. Thanks, Seth. And then for me, I'm actually from Idaho, but I grew up in Boise, so I don't necessarily have, again, like Seth, I don't necessarily have the rural connection that Jan has, but I have. I think at least the third generation that's been here. So I have one side of the family that grew up around the Emmett. There's a Letha over there that's kind of off the highway. So that kind of area, and also the other side is around the Kuna area. I think even they're probably out there before there was necessarily, I don't, well, I don't know if they predate Kuna, but I know they've been out there a long time. So then also I would like to say that for me, this is our second attempt at doing a rural profile. We initially started to do this in 2020. And then a little thing called pandemic kind of torpedoed that effort that year. But actually, it kind of works out because a lot of things happened after the pandemic, especially for Idaho and the rural parts. So being able to address this now is good, but also as we move forward, it gives us the opportunity to provide a 20-year change and compare it with kind of the last full comprehensive report that the Idaho Department of Labor did in 2005. Although I should mention that we have done other rural studies, although we just haven't done it on the comprehensive nature like the 2005 report. Sam Volkenauer did 2018 Future of Rural that uses the same definitions and template that this one did. But I think being able to look specifically at what the 2005 report and our colleagues that were here that we fondly remember and thank for their efforts here published and kind of gives us a nice way to kind of look at what we're looking at today in 2025 versus what 2005 and rural looked like for them. And so some of those, like in terms of demographics in the section, the highlights that report had from their analysis was that Idaho's population growth was growing at nearly double the national rate, which is similar to what we're doing now, but that the last 10, 15 years, Idaho's average growth has actually exceeded that, or if not, at times we were 3 times the national rate. And so we've kind of been sustaining that. At the time, they noted that there are 13 rural counties that had lost population from 2000 to 2003. Whereas compared to the previous couple of decades, there was only a couple of counties that lost population at each decade. And I bring that up because that's kind of like there's a shift, and they note this in the report that wasn't unique for Idaho. There was kind of this shift towards, the 80s. I think there's a lot of transformation happening in the 80s, and then the 90s, kind of seeing that continue. There was a lot more kind of focus and concentration in urban areas, and Idaho is certainly part of that. So that's one of the reasons you see that kind of change there. And as part of that, and what they pointed out in the 2005 report, was that the urban areas in Idaho are starting to grow and have an impact on the rural areas in different ways they had before. They're impacting traditional rural kind of field rural industries differently than they had before. And we've certainly seen that happen the last couple of decades. And certainly, what we're talking about with that COVID change and kind of what we'll get to the population here, there's this concentration that really started to move into the rural areas. And as the urban areas in Idaho started to increase in their size, that just continued to grow. So what is rural? What are we talking about here in terms of how are we defining it? There's lots of ways that researchers, policymakers, and analysts define rural. And we're using the same definition the 2005 report did, and it's one that they noted, and I think that I agree, is it has more of an Idaho feel. A lot of times that in terms of statistics, when you provide that definition, it's really what's the difference between urban and rural. Some reports or some, there's depending upon the type of agency or an analysis, it's between, can be between 5,000 and 50,000, depending on what's happening. But for us, there's kind of an Idaho feel in terms of what rural looks like. And for the Department of Labor, and I should mention that this profile of rural Idaho in 2005 was a collaborative effort between, at the time, it was Idaho Department of Labor and Commerce and Labor, I guess, if I got that mixed up. In addition, University of Idaho researchers, I think what we call now the McClure Center, and also this was sponsored by the Idaho Rural Partnership. So what they were looking at in terms of that definition was, starting with urban, an urban county in Idaho, or is at least, and I should say that our unit of measure is county. We don't really go beyond that in terms of what we're looking at in this study or in previous studies as well. And there's a number of reasons for that, but it just kind of makes our life easier in terms of being able to compare and make it more simple, I think, to explain how the whole mosaic of Idaho looks in terms of rural. Again, going back to urban, in Idaho, an urban county is one that has a city that with at least one city of a population of 20,000 residents or more. And then we have rural, which would basically be anything not that. But then we have three kind of subcategories or flavors of rural in Idaho that the previous colleagues had noted, which was first is a commuting county. Or commuting rural county. And that's one in which the workforce has a strong commuting tie to a metro county. And that's really kind of staked out by like at least a 25% commuting tie of that workforce. The next category would be rural center. And that's a county with it's either, you can call it an urban cluster or call it a town, village, pick your, what your title is for that kind of conglomeration of residents. But that urban cluster has a population of at least 7,500, but less than the 20,000, so not a city. And in addition, there's no strong commuting ties like what you would see in that commuting county. And then the final one is the open country. That is a county without the urban center that reaches at least 7,500 in residents, nor a city of 20,000 or more. In addition, there's no strong commuting ties. So basically, that I think the most rural counties, and by this definition, you're going from degrees of rural, if that's what this is getting at. So, so how has that? Idaho's gone through a lot of changes since 2003. What has that? What does that look like in terms of the last 20 years since we did this report in 2005? In that time, Idaho's gained a little over 600,000 people from 2003 to 2023. So what you see here is basically that year-over-year growth from that 2003, starting with, obviously the year-over-year growth from 2003 to 2004, all the way up to 2023. That rough, if you're looking at a 10-year annualized percentage change, that's about 1.9% annualized over those 10 years. If you take the full 20 years, that's 2%. So really, it's been a kind of a consistent level of growth, even with those variations. Of those 600,000 people that moved into Idaho, 100,000, or not, sorry, I should say moved. We're getting to in-migration. This is more, just as its residents in terms of difference from 2003 to 2023. So pardon my mistaken word there. So 100,000 additional people in rural areas over this 20-year period. That breaks down to about 18% of the statewide increase in population. And then I would point out again that the 2020, and that's again why it's probably useful that our plan to do a study in 2020 was upended, and we can kind of do this now. The Idaho had a huge amount of increase in that pandemic period and a couple of years following, 3.4% total population change for 2020. It's kind of calmed down those following years, but it's really kind of changed a little bit. I think some things in Idaho in terms of what we were expecting, or at least the trends of what we were seeing before. And obviously people were moving to open areas during those times, and the remote work actually made that more viable for a larger swath of people than there were before. So with that, let me get to, we have 3 interactive questions for you, and this is the first one. In the 2005 report, 35 of Idaho's 44 counties were classified as rural under the definition I posted a couple of slides ago. 20 years later, the number of rural counties in Idaho has decreased, remained the same, or increased. And Seth and Jan, what did you think the answer to this question was going to be when we first started this study? We'll start with Seth this time.
Yeah, I think just with, like we mentioned before, such strong, stable, and kind of explosive population growth in the latter years, that our rural county count would have declined from the 2005 report.
How about you, Jan?
Yeah, I would have thought that some of those would have transitioned into something a little different. And yeah, what's the answer? Oh, we have to wait a little while.
Yeah, okay. So interesting. 57% said decrease.
That's what
results. Decreased. So the number of rural counties decreased, which is in line with what your expectations were. 29% remained the same, and 14% said increase. So, the answer is it remains the same. So that was actually a kind of a surprise for us. So here's that same definition with the grid of how this lays out between the two respective years. So it's 2023, not 2024. So again, out of 44 counties, 35 are urban, and that's because in that previous slide I showed where those increases were, even though rural was getting a larger amount, the increases were being concentrated towards urban areas, and that seemed to be consistent with year over year. And so what we see is kind of, even though the urban counties remain the same, so in other words, we have a larger number of cities in those urban counties already that reached that 20,000. I think Star and Eagle and Ada County kind of, or at least in Southwest Idaho, kind of went over. So they're now would be considered additional 20,000 plus cities for those counties that they reside in. So you see those kind of urban counties that we had before are just more urban now. But what you see also in terms of the rural class, the subcategories we have, or the different flavors, is there's some changes there that's actually took place as far as the dynamic result of the population change I've seen in the last 2 decades. You see 2 additional commuting counties than were there before, 3 less rural centers. But what's interesting is there's 1 additional open country county than we had before. And so we'll kind of go through a few maps here and kind of show you how this lays out. And, this first map I'm not going to spend a lot of time here. It's basically just the mosaic of how all these look together in Idaho. Obviously, the open country account for the largest percentage and number of counties in terms of land area and the number of counties in Idaho. I should mention that rural Idaho counts for those 35 counties is 88% of Idaho's landmass. And then 28% of the population. And so we'll go forward here a little bit. So here's the urban counties that we have. So these are those 9 urban counties we were talking about before. They were the same 9 urban counties that the 2005 report designated as well. So obviously you have Ada County and Canyon County making up the southwest of the Boise MSA, part of the Boise MSA metropolitan statistical area. You have up north, you have Nez Perce and Latah County, Latah being home of U of I and Moscow, Idaho. And then, I'm sorry, and then also you have Kootenai County in the north with the Coeur d'Alene MSA. And really these dark patches really align with Boise's metropolitan statistical areas and not necessarily all the counties that are included in those particular MSAs, but at least in terms of the location. So Twin Falls, and then you have Bannock, Bonneville, and then Madison on the eastern side of the state. So going forward, looking at the rural counties, again, this is the 35 counties that were rural in 2005 as what we're showing in our report for 2025. But again, there's some changes as we get into the different flavors of rural Idaho. By the way, I should say, Jan, Seth, any comments? Anything you want to comment on that before I jump into the maps here too far? No, okay, fair enough. All right,
Yeah.
Sounds good. All right, so looking at the commuting rural counties. So again, these are those counties that have a strong commuting tie with those a metro county or a metro area in another county, and you see those at least 25% of the workforce commuting. I would like to note that we have other up there, and it should say other counties besides commuting. So we're just trying to focus in on the commuting counties here. Again, and if you look at to the graph or the grid we had before, there's 3 additional, actually there's 2 more of these than we had before. That's because we have 3 new ones and 1 fell off, or 1 was reclassified as non-commuting, and we'll get to that one here in another couple of slides. We have Bingham, Boise, Elmore, Franklin, Gem, Jefferson, Jerome, and Owyhee. The 3 new ones include Elmore, that has a stronger community tie to Ada County than it did in the 2005 report. It's home to Mount Home Air Force Base, as well as some other businesses and locations. We also have Jerome County, which is part of the Twin Falls MSA. So looking at this, we actually, in the previous map with urban, Idaho has 1 more metropolitan statistical area than it did in 2005. At that time, we just had 5. But now we have 6, and that 6 being the Twin Falls metropolitan statistical area. And Jerome County is part of that. So there's Twin Falls County and Jerome that's considered part of the MSA. But here you see where that Jerome commuting tie is really strong. So from Idaho's standpoint, in terms of how we classify a rural and the rural flavor, Jerome is a commuting county, which makes sense because it's there's that strong commuting component into Twin Falls. The third county that's has emerged as a commuting county as part of our study this year is Bingham, which is right on the east side. It's right in the middle between Pocatello and Idaho Falls. It's kind of the middle county, so you can really take your pick on. There's probably a strong connection, but going both ways. There's that strong probably commuting tie with both counties because there's only 1 county separating them really, and that's Bingham. And so you have kind of a commuting with 2 counties instead of just the 1. So, and there's 2 separate MSAs, by the way. So you have the Pocatello MSA as well as the Idaho Falls MSA.
I could jump in real quick, Craig, and just, it's always been fascinating to me how big Owyhee County is as far as landmass. And growing up in Mountain Home, all I ever knew about Owyhee County was Bruno and Grandview. And so when I saw this was commuting, I'm like, how could that be? They would, the reason they live there is because of they either ranch or farm, and there's some utilities that go on with the reservoir and irrigation, but not much else going on there. But the county seat is like the Homedale area, which is really close to Boise, so it totally makes sense. But density plays a huge role in that particular county because it is so little people living there, and they're kind of in extreme different spots. But yeah, I just wanted to comment. And then Elmore County, yeah, I would have thought that it might have shown up in the 2003 as a commuting because Micron had been in place and a lot of people were moving over, but maybe the housing hadn't quite expanded enough at that time.
That's a good point. Yeah, there's a lot of aspects to this that kind of wonder if why it wasn't showing up then, but to your point, yeah, it's like, but to me, I mean, I think it really also kind of exemplifies or is a good example of reminds us of how much Idaho has changed in the last 20 years compared to where we were in 2005. Not, I mean, Idaho was
Boy,
good.
howdy.
Yeah, boy, howdy. Let's leave it at that. I want to make sure I kind of get through my section here, so both Jan and Seth get enough time for theirs, but I'll just finish off here with uh, 2 or 3 more slides. The rural centers, it's the least number of rural counties in again, the flavor of Idaho rural. So again, these are the ones that have at least a conglomeration of residents that of 7,500 and don't have strong commuting ties. You have one up north with the Sound Point area in Bonner County. And then you have Payette County over there that's kind of has a strong little center there. But then the most of them are in that in Seth's area, that south central area, with Blaine County and some of those. Seth, did you want to throw any kind of comment about that?
Yeah, so the mini Kasia area also has quite a strong manufacturing and agriculture tie, just like most of my region. However, those counties have enough on their own. They don't have really strong commuting ties into Twin Falls County, actually. As kind of that the Magic Valley really has exploded, mini Kasia has experienced some of that business as well. And then for Blaine County, high amenity resort community. And during the pandemic, we saw lots of people working remote now through a lot of these many counties like Teton or Blaine County. And I think we have seen a lot of movement to that area.
Thank you. All right, and then we'll go to the final flavor, which is open country. Again, this has about the largest number of counties in terms of rural type. In Idaho, again, these are the ones that really kind of figure in terms of when you think of rural Idaho. I think these are kind of the ones that really kind of probably top of mind. They're also the ones that, consistent with the 2005 report, some of these counties that have kind of like world-class natural amenities that people really enjoy, and like there maybe kind of there's a resort around it perhaps, or that kind of establishment. Valley County and Teton County are both one of the highest growing rates and what we've seen from one year to the next or over the last 20 years in terms of this. But there's one county here that was originally in the 2005 report was commuting, and that's Power. It's now rural, and just in terms of the statistics we received, it looks like what commuting tie it had in 2005 isn't necessarily as strong as it was. I'm sorry, 2025 isn't as strong as it was in 2005. And then I think, Jan, you were kind of commenting on this yesterday a little bit.
I think there also may be some things that are in the background. The Power was part of Bannock County as a metropolitan statistical area back then. And I think maybe some of the commuting that occurred within its actual county being part of the MSA, they counted as commuting. It just doesn't seem to have changed that much to me. I mean, they've certainly lost a food processor, but they've also expanded an existing food processing plant. It doesn't seem like a whole lot more than that is going on, but perhaps there's just more housing being developed outside of that county too, which is another topic for another day.
That's one of the reasons we're doing this in multiple parts, not just all in one and dumping on everybody here. I would also say that that's actually kind of, just as with in our line of business, kind of dealing, the smaller counties, it becomes a challenge with, there's lots of variance with data a little bit. And so sometimes you get kind of wild swings with it just because of, how the instruments we get to measure these things operate.
Scale.
So sometimes it might just be, like to Jan's point, it may not be that much change, but just in terms of the statistics we get, there might be enough to like move it from one to the other. So yeah, thank you, Jan. All right, and then my final slide is basically looking at this over the last 20 years, and what does this mean in terms of the proportion of population in Idaho, and how has that shifted from urban for urban and rural, and how does it look in terms of the population? So I chose to use like people per 1,000, but if you just use math and make it 68.1%, it's the same thing. So it's just a matter of moving that decimal a little bit. But I figure this is a little bit more accessible in terms of what that means. So from 2003 to 2023, Idaho is more urban than it was in 2003. Whereas there was 681 per thousand in Idaho's population in 2003 that were considered living in rural, 724 today. So, a change of about 5%, if you're looking at it from 5 percentage points. But if you're looking at the rural counties, there's a smaller proportion of Idaho's population that live in rural comparatively. But you look at those flavors, there's kind of a big shift. And part of that might be just in terms of the number of counties that are now in these categories. Again, there's two additional commuting rural counties than there were, in terms of numbers, although there's 3 brand new ones. So where there was 54 per thousand in 2003, there's now 101. So again, that kind of gets at how, even though our number of urban versus rural counties have remained the same, those urban counties are larger in terms of people and having a bigger imprint around those surrounding counties and creating more connections. And so that's why we see a higher number in commuting counties.
Yeah, I agree, Craig. A lot of these counties are so close to a metropolitan area that you can easily live there and still experience some of the amenities of a larger city. And so I think that's really attractive to a lot of people that are coming, especially from another state.
All right, and then rural centers, again, there's fewer counties there. They're in that category, and then also open country. But it's also expresses how the population change in Idaho has been a little bit, or has hedged towards urban, I think, still in the last 20 years. All right, with that, Jen, I'm going to turn this over to you. This is now your section here. Thank you for that. But when you
So I'm going to be going over migration, and I do have a trivia question that's going to pop up if you guys could all answer it. In the most recent population release, the annual release, what percentage of Idaho's growth came strictly from net migration, meaning the number of people moving in versus the number of people moving out netted? So if you guys could answer that. The next set of information, as you answer that, I'll go through and explain what we're going to be seeing. I have a series of maps directed at different decades, starting with the 70s, moving up to the 2000 to 2023, and just seeing what shifts, what changes have occurred from the previous decade as far as migration numbers. And so it's strictly just, that change in migration. So do we have the answer to that yet? Or not the answer, but the responses? So most people think that it was 33%, well, no, 63%. Secondly, 33%, 50%, and then 80%. It was amazingly high this last transition, 80%. We have had periods of time where they were 63, but this last rendition, 80% of our population growth came from migration. And that's why we think it's so important. Natural growth used to be quite robust, and you will see some of that showing up in these migration maps where it wasn't quite as important for migration. We're going to run through them quickly. The browns are losses. I'm going to have Craig go through it twice, actually. The browns are losses. The gold is 2% loss to 2% gain, so kind of flat. And then the blue is net gains, over 2% from the previous decade. So you can see there's dramatic changes from each decade. And we can stop here, Craig. Starting with 1970, this was a time when we were still very natural resource based. And you can see that, we had gained a lot of people coming in just in the natural course of things. But when you look at it, it was about 215,000. It wasn't one of our most robust population gains, but it was 215,000. That was the year that for people that lived in the Boise MSA, that was the year that HP decided to settle. I'm going to do kind of a walk down memory lane. And you might think, why is what is the importance of a large company coming to a metro area for rural Idaho? But quite frankly, all of those goods producing industries have huge multipliers. They require big supply chains, and agriculture is goods producing. We've had that in place for a long time. Mining is goods producing, but we also have construction that was really starting up. We started to have some more people coming in, obviously, 200,000 growth. And we also had manufacturing that was starting to take off with HP, they did some services, but they manufactured and designed those in the Boise area. People could live outside in the rural areas and commute easily because we have great infrastructure in Idaho. We know that our snowstorms can be bad on occasion, but not typically. And so, it was the start of high tech in southern Idaho and eventually bled up into northern Idaho too as we go along. So there we go. We had very few that lost, but this next decade was our dog. This was the dog of all Idaho decades. And we do follow the economy of the nation. And this was a double dipper recession decade, but it particularly hit farmers poorly. Interest rates were so high, they have to get their renewable lines of credit each year. Oil prices were high. There was all sorts of negativity going on in the economy, and it impacted Idaho with a great loss. Now, quite frankly, we had a population gain overall for Idaho in the 80s. We were up, I think it was 46% growth or 46,000 in growth, but we lost 42,000 in migration. So that was the year of the big impact by a brain drain. We were worried about losing our youth. They were leaving to go to other states because agriculture was there, but we weren't quite as diversified as we needed to be. But we did see another big manufacturer come into place that also impacted much of the state because it continued to drive up the number of engineers we needed in particularly my region, Southwestern. Adding to HP, it was Micron. And then we go into the 90s and it just totally took a dive or it continued to grow. Pardon me, I'm coming off the 80s where it was a dive. We really didn't have, when you look at those gold, they really weren't big losses. They were more just flat growth. They were in those areas that are open country and don't have a lot of density. The the places that took some losses had, once again, a lot of ag, but we had huge construction going on this year, Micron continuing to ramp up, more food processing coming into being, and dairies flocking over in the late 80s and 90s because of environmental reasons in California, the second largest dairy state, which moved Idaho to the third largest. If we could go on to the next. And in one thing I failed to note on the last one, we had 263,000 in population growth. That's our highest decade. This decade was good. Don't get me wrong, it was 255,000, but we hit that Great Recession and our construction started to fall off towards the end. You can see the areas that did not do well during this time, and they were definitely not the urban areas. They were the areas that were more open country, maybe dependent a little bit more on some of the natural resources that were evolving out. But really, we didn't have a lot of negatives. They were more just flat, except for Bear Lake. Some of the tourism areas took a big hit when we had 911. So Bear Lake was down 13% as far as its migration in. But we had 20 negative, meaning just barely into the zeros in this particular decade. We continue to return and recover from the Great Recession on the next slide. And you can see a lot more green, our net gain. This particular decade had 216,000 as far as population growth. A lot of that was due to in-migration. And you can see once again some of the less dense areas or the ag areas might have not had as much migration into it. But then that all changed when we hit the pandemic, which is the next slide. And during that time, everybody saw great migration. And that was our big commentary during this time, is that the growth was really spread out a lot more than we had seen in the past. It wasn't just the urban areas. And we did have a few that were flat and just kind of a little bit negative. That four of them actually, or no, just the two, and then the other two were positive, but just the gold ones were just very low growth. And that was Elmore County and Cassia County. And part of that had to do with, once again, we'll get into some housing issues. They do have needs, and they would have taken more immigration if there had been more housing available, especially new housing. But it's 121,000 was our population growth in this particular time period, 2.1% annual growth compared to the 90s when it was 2.3% average annualized growth. So we don't know how this is going to end up. This could take a variety of directions, but we did see this last year in 2024 that once again we're moving back to the urban area growth a little bit more. This is a summary of what happened in each decade as far as growth, and you can see 1980 was the year we had some real negative migration, then negative 42,000, but you can see that urban was really big during the time period when all the construction was going on in the 2000s, the early 2000 to 2010, and it has continued but fallen off during the pandemic. We saw more widespread growth. So the next slide will also be a summary. If you could go, there we go. And it just shows that pretty much in all of our different definitions of rural, that and urban and the state, you can see that in all cases migration has increased from 2003 to 2023, whereas natural change has decreased in almost every area except the commuting, in which I talked about earlier. It's just so close to those areas that are bigger. And it did have just a tiny smidge of an increase as far as natural change. So natural change is births and deaths, how that nets out. And usually it's always positive, but these days, that's not always the case. You can see that rural Idaho really contributed, though. If it had just been urban, it would have only been up so far in the dark brown, but it's up even higher in the state using all of the growth that occurred in commuting, open county, and rural. So migration was a huge, huge impact on Idaho, and that wraps up my part of things.
Thank you, Jen. Before we go to Seth, I just want to kind of what you just said. I was just noticing as you were talking and describing each of these decades and kind of looking at the different flavors of rural and how they shift depending upon the different economic situation we're looking at for that decade. You know, you're talking about the 80s being a challenge. So everyone's kind of, you know, losing together, but it looks like people are moving more towards cities, not necessarily in Idaho, but losing population. But specifically, like, you know, the 1990s, everything's growing, or you have like the housing bubble. There's, you know, rural centers are growing, but it's kind of, you know, it's there's not really a lot of people moving out to those commuting or open country. It starts to, as things improve, but especially with the pandemic in 2020, it really kind of again talks about how that 2020 really kind of changed the direction, I think. Thank you, Jan. That was really good. And then we will go to Seth. Seth, it's all you.
All right, we'll try to breeze past this so we have some time for questions. For the trivia question, well, first of all, I'm going to be looking at some aging demographics information and then wrapping up with some education information. So the trivia question is, as of 2023, what % of Idaho's open country is age 65 years and older?
Glad you didn't put 65 up here, 65 or 80%.
Yeah, no, number's not that high.
Which is encouraging. You know, I think
yeah.
a lot of people think that everyone is retired here sometimes.
Yeah.
Turns out
All right. It was a high number. It was not 35, but it was 24%. So, of Idaho's open country is age 65 and older. So for the next slide, we want to look at. Yeah, this is looking at the share of Idaho's population age 65 and up. We like looking at this number because it usually indicates someone who's about to age out, retire out of the labor force, or already has. So really, we're kind of trying to look at kind of our retired populations, or those who probably aren't in our labor force, which is helpful when we're labor economists. So that's something we're interested in looking at. It has grown in all of our urban and rural areas. So we have seen a significant portion of our net migration being those who are retired or soon to be retired, but those numbers are growing much faster in our open country and our rural centers. So we've noticed that our urban areas and those commuting areas, which share a lot of the amenities and job growth and creation of urban areas, have seen that gain, but nowhere near the level of our rural centers and our open country. Kind of on the flip side of this coin, this graph is looking at potential workers age 25 through 65 per retiree. So this is, again, we're looking at some of our aging population demographics. This does put pressure on our current workforce. We do see, as our population ages, we're talking about a workforce shortage we've been talking about for a while. On the demographic side, this is really what we're looking at here. So for all of our areas, again, we have seen less workers for every retiree, but these growths are slower in our urban and commuting areas, and again, faster in our rural centers and open countries, or open, yeah. And then looking at our populations age 65 years and older, kind of on the county map side. In 2000, if we look at the red, that's our 15% and over population age 65 years and older. It's really concentrated in the north central part of the state. It has been the oldest part of our state for quite a while. And then looking at forward 23 years, most of our state is aged has 15% or more population age 65 and older. So where in 2000 this metric of over and under 15% was good, it's really not sufficient in 2023 as our population has continued to age. And then kind of the flip side of that coin, looking at under 18 years of age in 2000, a majority of our younger counties were nestled in the southern part of the state. And that's still true in 2023, but we can see a pretty significant drop off in our younger counties. Again, reflecting just kind of the demographic transition that Idaho is going through, but this is also most of the developed world as fertility rates have declined. This really isn't an Idaho problem. It's really a developed nation problem.
And before we move to the next slide, Seth, I would like on this slide and the previous one, again, we're providing that those thresholds, we're putting those in to compare like the difference between the 2005 report and 2025. And like Seth mentioned, you know, those thresholds of like over and under for both the 30% on the 18 and under, as well as the 65 and older, those were sufficient to provide a decent comparative difference between the counties. And it, like Seth mentioned, this is just kind of the thing we've been hitting the drum about in terms of what the demographics in the US have been doing. So, you know, it's just, again, kind of confirming that. And I would like to add that, you know, we'll probably update with kind of the thresholds towards the end of this year that we can, with our final report, that will be able to provide those kind of more contextual changes, I think, and then something that you know, if someone does the same thing 20 years from now, they'll be able to provide that same commentary from our standpoint. So thank you for that indulgence, Seth.
Yeah, and then just to wrap up before questions, I want to briefly look at how educational attainment, specifically for advanced degrees, has changed in Idaho. So the graph on the left is looking at the population 25 years and older with a bachelor's degree or higher in 2000, and the 20% or higher is in that deep kind of that ocean blue there, and it's really almost only in our rural areas, our urban areas, outside of a couple high amenity rural areas like Blaine County or Teton County. But outside of that, we didn't see those really high rates of advanced degrees. Kind of again, on the flip side, if we look at 2019 through 2023 here on the right, a vast majority of our counties, urban or rural, have 20% or more of their adult populations with advanced degrees. And so I think, again, as in Idaho, we've mentioned as Idaho's industrialized more, the need for more advanced degrees, and just as the state's grown. We've also seen, again, we mentioned before, as broadband access has increased all across the state, the viability of teleworking has increased as well. So yes, Idaho's demand for advanced degrees and just broader a swath of adults in our state have advanced degrees.
All right, thank you, Seth. And I would just like to say that there's a lot more about education we're going to explore in subparts of our rural profile series this year. So this is just a little taste of what we're looking at from a demographics standpoint. But again, education will be a specific part that we'll address, and probably the critical trends, and probably as well as the economic and workforce that's coming in June, and the critical trends is in September. But with that, I'm just going to remind people that this is kind of at the end of our demographic webinar. If you have any questions, please throw those into the Q&A in the Zoom button at the bottom. I'd be happy to address any comments, questions you might have over what you've seen, or maybe you have a question about something we haven't addressed yet. Happy to field any kind of questions you have. I'd just like to remind you, this is going to be a comprehensive study over the next year. We'll release a kind of a different section along in the following quarters, June and September, like I just mentioned, and then a full report in December. And then, so while we're waiting for questions, I know you mentioned it already once, Jan, but I would think it's worth kind of mentioning that, the latest census data that we had last week, I believe it was, kind of showed that maybe the trends we're looking at, there might be a switch a little bit, at least in terms of 2024 data. Is that correct?
Yes. Actually, we were waiting to see the county data that was just released earlier this month to actually see what was going on, because we knew Idaho had a certain amount of growth last December. Then they released the county information, and it was pretty much across the nation, not just in Idaho, but that particular trend that had been going on, in which some of the big cities across the nation had actually contracted, or big counties had contracted, that seems to be reversed, and they're starting to grow again. And same with our urban counties. We're seeing they were bringing in the heft of the population growth as far as in-migration again. So I always think it's tied to jobs. We've had some new released projects out there that are happening in our rural areas. I look at my Canyon County, and to me it seems very rural, but yet it's considered an urban county. It has so much agriculture, but it has so much industrialization, and services are becoming more of a thing there too. So, it'll be really great to see this next part of our decade and how it evolves. But yeah, the little sprint that we had in which rural seemed to take in some of the growth seems to have evaporated, at least this last year. Maybe not totally evaporated, but and we've also seen the trend of slower growth since that big rush in the early part of the pandemic. So
all right, thank you, Jan. We do have one question from the audience, which is, are teleworkers part of the commuter flavor? And I'll just go back to that map real quick. And I'll just say that the commuting ties comes from a census product called On the Map. And I'll have to defer to Jan on this one, but I don't believe remote teleworking is part of that. It's a measuring of physical movement from home to workplace. Is that correct?
that is correct. But once again, our data is a little tough because a lot of our reports are voluntary. So if we have multi-site reports, we can really track our county employment well. If a big company chooses not to break out their employment by county, it gets a little bit more difficult for us. But if your company is out of state and they're reporting you into our unemployment administrative records, it will be under the county where you're working, not because they won't have a physical presence in the state, so they would not show up in the commuting.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
Good to know. Always with our business, data questions are always complicated.
Yeah, it depends.
Depends.
Yeah.
Technically. All right. All right. I don't see any further questions. So Jan, Seth, any comments, final comments you might have for our topic? No? Okay.
Well, I'll just say I really look forward to all of these releases when they come from the census, and I think they're really important. And I just I hope that we can continue to see this same thing going on. But I don't know how our rural counties will fare. They may totally change. There may be some policy issues that totally change the composition of our rural counties. Public lands could change. There could be changes in schools and how they're administered. It's going to be a really interesting decade. And so that's my main comment.
I think, I think, from my standpoint, I think that, went to see a comedian here, and when he started it, this is a few years ago, this is before the pandemic even. He just said, "Well, everyone knows you; they're coming, whether you like it or not." So I think people are going to still kind of move to Idaho. I think it's going to be one of those things where, it's. I remember the decades that, between 2010 and 2020, before the pandemic, but after the Great Recession, Idaho's economy really took off. 2015, we were getting. I would go to a presentation and I'd hear anecdotes about how people just pulled up roots and just moved to Idaho without a job, showed up to the library to ask about how to get one, and just so I think to some extent we're probably going to still see that. But to your point, I don't know that I think the demographics of the nature of the population aren't necessarily it's not going to be at the rates we saw. Partly because Idaho's bigger, but I think it's just in terms of there isn't as much movement around the nation.
That's what I'm curious about this next decade. We mentioned before we saw growth even in our most rural areas over the pandemic, and if that can hold or how that will change and evolve over the next decade, I think it's definitely going to be something to be watching out for.
Well, and I'd also say it's not surprising to me that we don't really have a lot of questions here. I was coming into this that when we just talk about demographics, it's not a lot of. I mean, we're not really. I think we're not really telling a story that is necessarily news to everybody. Although I think just from our first question, everyone was expecting to see more urban counties, and the nature of how the population growth came in, it didn't necessarily. It is more urban, but not to the point where we have more counties that are urban. But I think I think the next parts are going to be more interesting and probably generate more questions and more, from my standpoint, where looking at the economic side and how things have changed, and also the critical trends will be very interesting. And I think to that end, I'll just kind of close it up and say that once we post this this link and also our report, we'll make sure that you can access the 2005 report as well, just so you can kind of look at that and see how browse the differences between what the mindset was looking at Idaho in that nature back then versus now. So. And with that, since there's no questions, I'll just kind of bring our webinar to a close and just say thank you. I'll just say thanks to Seth and Jan for being on the panel with me. I think it's been very good. Thanks for your time and effort, and as well as all the support here at Department of Labor that made this possible. You know who you are. I would say our next webinar is scheduled for Tuesday, April 8th. Brandon Young, our labor economist in Pocatello, will be talking about childcare and labor force participation. So if you're interested in that, please sign up and make sure you attend. And the Idaho Department of Labor offers many services, which includes free access to labor market information, which you can get at lmi.idaho.gov. I want to thank you for attending. Have a great day, an excellent spring, and be excellent to each other. So
take care.
Everyone.